Well, why don't we make a start of it? I want to
Sounds good.
welcome folks this evening to our conversation this evening around an interesting and controversial topic entitled, Can Government Shut Down a Church's Worship? And my name is Stephen Andrews. I'm the principal of Wycliffe College, and it's my privilege to be able to moderate this conversation this evening. And we've got a couple of guests that are joining us. Two well-respected pastors in the GTA, and one of them is, I think, new to this forum, and that's the Reverend Dr. K. Rick Baker. He's a graduate of the University of Western Ontario in London and London Baptist Seminary, and he has a Doctor of Ministry from Liberty University. He's lead pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in Oshawa, which is part of the Fellowship Baptist denomination. He's in his 20th year, I think, with the church, and he's married with 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren. He's an outdoorsman who appreciates the beauty of God's hand in creation, and he has an unexplainable affection for sports teams from Boston and Pittsburgh. Although I have to say that the wild card game was truly wild when the Steelers didn't quite make it through. Rick, welcome to our conversation this evening. Welcome to the Fireside Chat at Wycliffe College.
Thank you, Stephen. Great to be with you.
Our other guest is the Reverend Pau Carter, and Paul is familiar to some of us who are used to these evenings. He's lead pastor at Cornerstone Baptist Church in Orillia. He's married with 5 children. He attended Moody Bible Institute and is a graduate of York University and McMaster Divinity College. He's been in pastoral ministry since 1984, serving in both Fellowship and Canadian Baptist churches in Oakville and Mississauga, and now in Orillia. He's an author and speaker and co-founder of the Covenant Life Renewal Society, and he sits on the Ontario Council for the Gospel Coalition. And I hope many of you know that he is the host and Bible teacher on TGC Canada's Into the Word podcast. And he returns to Wycliffe College for another fireside conversation. And welcome, Paul. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be here. One clarification is I've only been in ministry since 1994, not 84. I'm not quite that old yet.
No, I'm glad you corrected that. Actually, I've got a sort of mathematical dyslexia.
And, no worries. I just didn't want to claim more veteran status than I was due. Yeah.
Well, tonight we want to talk about the church in its 2 allegiances. Its allegiance to the kingdom of God and to the king of the kingdom of God, and its allegiance to government in its call to be citizens of good reputation. But I want, in setting the stage, first of all, to get acquainted a little bit with our guests. So let's start with you, Rick, and I wonder if you just describe your church to us and tell us how your ministry and the ministry of your church has changed since the advent of COVID.
Thank you, Stephen. Our church is, as you know, located in Oshawa, Ontario, and we're a church congregation of about 1,500 people. And so, as you can imagine, the restrictions that have been put on throughout this, based on the size of our group, has scattered us pretty significantly. So it's made a big change in how we have been interacting with one another, and or the lack thereof. And even with some of the lighter restrictions, it was impossible for us to do some of the things that we've been used to doing. And so that's at this point, of course, down to 10 people. What we've done is remained open to provide for those who have a convictional sense that meeting together is necessary. And so we happen to have possession of 2 buildings that are close to each other. And so we've been able to run 20 people at a time in time slots for the last few Sundays since the harder restriction lockdowns come on. And we've placed before our church the open invitation that because it's lawful to gather, We'll remain open and host opportunities for gatherings of 10 all week long if that's of interest or value to people. So at this point, we've been up to as high as 15 services on a Sunday. And so that's previously, of course, before COVID, it was 2 services a Sunday in our buildings.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, people are certainly hungry for personal fellowship. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Paul, what about you?
Well, we're a church. We were a church of about 650 before the pandemic hit. Obviously, nobody really knows. It feels like we've grown during this time. It's just the remarkable favor of God. We've had a lot of people connect and even take membership over the course of this pandemic, which is really, really odd. Again, hard to figure out apart from the grace of God. Like Rick, we were fortunate in that we had access to 2 buildings. So we were in the process of planting a church when COVID struck. And the target, it was sort of a slow launch. The target for full launch, full autonomy for the church is June 1st, 2021. So we were in the late stages of an 8-year plant cycle with them. But as a result, we had access to 2 buildings. And when we were only allowed to meet with the 30% capacity, there were a couple Sundays when we were able to get physically over 500 people into services between the 2 buildings, because we ran 2 services here at the main campus and then another service at the plant campus. So that didn't feel during that stage of the pandemic, I would say I felt like it wasn't really a great hindrance. It was just a little more work for me, 2 services instead of 1 at the main campus, 1 service at the plant. We were doing 1 service at the plant anyway. And we were able to, with the spacing, because it was a fairly large building for a plant that starts small, obviously, we were able to get almost the entire plant congregation into services with the 30% spacing requirements. So I would say during that stage, we did not feel greatly hindered. We obviously had vulnerable folks who weren't engaging, and we had to check in with them in various ways. During this more severe stage, which is now the second version of the severe lockdown, we've been trying to do as much online as we can. So we've done online Bible studies. We have an online Bible study that uses a particular Bible reading plan, and that's been really well engaged. An incredible number of our people have engaged in that. I've been blown away by the level of engagement. And then, like Rick, we do the small services that are permitted. So we have, I think last week we had 7 small services. I really like them. Obviously, it's not the same as being all together, but I feel like it's different. It's marvelous. It's small. It's simple. And but again, serving only a fraction of our people in that sense. And we've kind of ramped up. We have a fairly extensive deacon type ministry where we deliver benevolent care, basic services to folks in the vulnerable sector, in our own community, and then in the community at large. And we've tried to really redirect a lot of our energies into that.
Good. Thank you very much. So it's clear that we're learning new ways to exercise the ministry that God's given us in these really unusual circumstances. So it's encouraging to hear how your 2 churches have responded to the demands. But of course, there are other churches that chafe under the regulations from the government. And so tonight's theme is, can government shut down a church's worship? And it's been much in the news, particularly in the last couple of weeks. That last week, the Attorney General ordered Trinity Bible Chapel outside of Waterloo to abide by lockdown protocols because of the plans that the church or the chapel had to hold in-person services that would exceed the maximum number of 10 people allowed. And the pastor there said that he was willing to get arrested for doing what he said we have done for 2,000 years. He claimed that hosting worship is an essential service. The faithful at Trinity Bible Chapel has now found support from the pastor of Faith Presbyterian Church in Tilsonburg, who claims that the church, and here I'm quoting from him, the church must continue to gather for worship with or without the permission of our civil authorities. And although the news article I read doesn't give sort of theological or biblical reasoning for this, I suppose that they would cite Acts chapter 5:29, obey God rather than human authority. Our premier, on the other hand, has called Trinity Chapel's actions irresponsible, careless, and disappointing. And other Christian leaders point out that the Bible tells us that Christians are subject to the governing authorities. This, of course, is Romans chapter 13, verse 1, and compare with 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. And St. Paul there continues, or as St. Peter continues, the authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. So we do have clearly a biblical precedent or warrants for different ways that the church might respond to these governmental restrictions. And before we actually dive into that, I want to ask a higher level question, a bigger question in some respects, and that is, why is this an important issue to discuss? How important is this controversy, really? I mean, you know, debating the question of whether Christians can be compelled to go to war is one thing, but when the church's energies could be going into the alleviation of suffering that's going on around us, when we could be having a conversation about providing spiritual care for people who are experiencing grief or loss and financial bankruptcy as a result of COVID, why should we be debating matters having to do with whether Christians should observe guidelines that are designed to protect human life? Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
Well, I would say in general, controversy is when we tend to think about these things. You know, by and large, the church responds to pressure and controversy by clarifying doctrines that they may not otherwise have felt the need to be clear on, right? It was the controversies over Trinity and over Christology in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries that resulted in many of the doctrines that we have in church today. And so I would say, in a sense, this is just how it is. We don't tend to think about things until we're under pressure, and we're under pressure now. And in living memory, and I would say more than living memory, there was a brief moment during the Spanish flu in 1918 when churches were thinking about this, but that was a reasonably short duration. Generally, I think you could say it's been 250, 300 years since Protestants, certainly in North America, have really had to think about what does it mean to find ourselves in conflict with the civil magistrate. Let's be clear. In Canada, the Canadian government pays me to be a generous giver and participant at my church. Like, that's a unique moment in time. I have charter freedoms. I get a tax receipt. It's quite marvelous. This is the first time in my lifetime, my parents' lifetime, my grandparents' life, my great-grandparents' lifetime, that we've had to wrestle with the issue of where does the state's authority infringe or encroach upon my liberty and the liberty of my local assembly. It's a great conversation. I'm glad we're having it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add to that Paul, apparently you don't actually have charter freedoms, and I think that's perhaps the reason that conflict has arisen to the degree it's arisen. I think I would approach the question that's being asked right now on two levels. One, I think the church is jumpy, particularly right now, because prior to the pandemic, there has been a series of affronts to evangelical theology and its right to exist in the country, Trinity Western University, and other issues that have come up, and now Bill C-6 with the possible muzzling of discussions on sexual identity and other conversation. And I think the moment was a little hot already And the pandemic and the restrictions the government now imposed upon churches perhaps put it over the edge. And I think of churches like the church in Waterloo are expressions of that kind of angst and the concern that maybe religious charter rights on religious freedom is a bygone situation, and so there's pushback, serious pushback, and coupled with the other question, Paul, you talked about doctrine. I think, why is this important to clarify? I think we all know that Christ himself defined only one thing that he was actually building in this era, and that's the church. And so how the church is treated, how the church is defining itself, our ecclesiology, clarifying our ecclesiology is absolutely critical. And so unless we understand our ecclesiology, and it appears to me that we've become woefully weak in that, and this pandemic has sort of shone a searchlight on the glaring deficiencies we have in our understanding of our ecclesiology. Unless we get that right, we really can't answer the question of what rights do the government have to impose anything on us. And so I think that's the starting point that most of us have backed up. I know, at our church, I realized, this was a moment we better clarify our doctrine. So we've started this will be the third Sunday of a 4-month run at least on the doctrine of ecclesiology. So we understand who we are, and then what the church has to face in terms of government. So I think that's what's fired it up, and that would be, why is it important? Because it's God's church. That is the reason that anything to do with the church is important. It belongs to God, and we better get it right. We better know how to please him properly, and we better know how to live in this particular moment on the basis of our understanding of that truth.
Cool. That's really a great introduction, I think, to our conversation. It's a good reminder that when it's in periods of conflict like this, that we come about finding clearer understanding of the nature of who we are and God's mission. And I want certainly to return to these really important questions, perhaps more towards the end. But we are in the midst of this conflict, people trying to understand the relationship between the church's autonomy and freedom and liberty, and the ability of the state to govern that. And perhaps this would be a really good time to find out from the folks who've tuned in to our conversation just where they stand on this. So I'm going to ask Terry to put up a poll that people can take. And the question is, first of all, are government's guidelines for religious gatherings too restrictive, not restrictive enough, or just about right? And in respect to gathering, do you think that we should wait until the government says it's safe to come back together? Or should we wait to meet in safe ways despite the government regulations? Or should we try to meet in safe ways despite the government regulations? Should we not meet at all, acknowledging the government guidelines are already a concession? Number 4, churches should decide on their own about meeting. Or 5, churches have no obligations to listen to government guidelines. So I'll just take a moment for folks to fill out their responses to that, and then we'll see what they conclude. This very interesting response. Before I end the poll, Rick or Paul, what do you think? Do you think that not you yourself, but what do you think is the general opinion of folks in your churches? Are government guidelines for religious gatherings too restrictive, or not restrictive enough, or about right?
Well, I would say in our church, the approach that we have advocated for as a leadership team is that we will use 100% of the permission that's given to us by the government in this situation. So if they give us 30% capacity, then we'll run multiple services at 30% capacity. If they let us, if they say that having 10 people well spaced out is safe, then we'll do that. But we don't feel that there's a compelling argument at this point for civil disobedience. And so far, I would say, as I said, in a church of about 650 or 700, I'm only aware of 3 or 4 people who have voiced opposition to that viewpoint. Everybody else has been really affirming.
Mm-hmm. Rick, what would your congregation say?
Well, our congregation is somewhat mixed, but I would in general think that the congregation is reflective of the general fear of the community, of the culture at this moment of the virus.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that theology has taken a backseat to fear of health and welfare, which is a difficult and challenging struggle as the a pastoral leader who fundamentally is looking from a theological perspective and recognizing that whether it's right or wrong, the moment has decided to impose upon human life a great fear, which is being even heightened as of tonight with more impositions of restrictions by our political leaders, heightening the fears. So I think the congregation is reflecting a fear of gathering, and that would be reflective in the fact that when we could get together, 30%, we were not able to max out those numbers.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting and important pastoral dimension. Well, here are the results to the poll. So 56% of those joining our conversation this evening feel the government as being too restrictive, but 39% feel that it's just about right. And then in terms of gathering, 33% say we should wait until the government says it's safe, whereas nearly an equal amount think we should try to find safe ways, irrespective of the government's regulations in these matters. Do those results surprise you?
No, I don't think so. In fact, the fact that we're having this conversation suggests that there is a spectrum of views within evangelicalism or within the church as a whole. So I would expect to see those views reflected in the numbers. There is not broad consensus on how these things should be handled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would concur with that. I think that does reflect what I'm encountering or what I'm seeing with people as well. I think it's important to say for those who, in terms of the restrictions, I think it's important for every region to note that the story isn't the same for everywhere in Ontario either, in terms of danger and risk. GTA is different. The center of Toronto is different. Our own region has had zero cases of transmission in the Durham region from places of worship since March 2020, zero. So that doesn't seem to be being taken into consideration in the government's choices with what to do or not to do. It's with zero transmission, it would seem that the restrictions were fine and that the safeguards that were put up have been adequate, and
Mm-hmm.
churches need not to be as restricted as they are. So I'm not sure people are getting all the good information either. At the level of leaders, I'm digging around, looking at health records, looking at doing our own research, finding out what's going on, but that's not being necessarily transferred by the media to our congregations, and they don't really necessarily know whether church is a safe place or not a safe place.
Yeah, and still, evidence is still being compiled, and opinions change and such. It has been hard to find people that are on the same page in terms of their understanding of the nature of risk for themselves. Well, let's move into this question a little bit more deeply. You've raised it already. I want to take the words from Pastor Richardson of Faith Presbyterian Church. When he said that his greater concern, he talked about it's important to gather together for the sake of the community, he said, but our greater concern is our obligation to God. He said, we are called by God to give him one day in 7. It's a day that belongs to him and a day in which God's people are called together corporately. We must honor God rather than men. And biblically speaking, we know of no other church than one that gathers. I want to know, do you agree with Pastor Richardson in this respect? I mean, Rick, you've already started to talk a little bit about the nature of the gathered church and how that is meant to be identified ecclesiologically. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually fundamentally agree with him. I think that the scriptures and the history of the church and the history of God's people, frankly, I think Richardson talks about the Old Testament. I think he talks about the 10 Commandments. He talks about the first 4 commandments being, in essence, worship and gathering concepts. And I don't disagree with him at all. In fact, I don't think this is a time for us to lighten our definition, our theological definition of the church. I think a lot of us have been trying to sort of salve our theological conscience by reducing our definition of church. Church means gather. Ecclesia means gather. It always has. It was a secular word that was used for those who were called out to gather for business purposes. That was an ecclesia. It's the choice of the word translated from Hebrew into the Septuagint was kahal, which was, as opposed to other words they could have used, and it was assembly. It was meant to be an assembly. There's no need for us to water down our understanding, nor our understanding of offering to God a concentrated day, a gathering set aside for Sabbath, for worship. The starting question is, can the government close down worship or shut down worship? Well, the answer is no, because we're not hostage to worship in one day or in one place ever. In fact, we're called to be living sacrifices, which means we're by our living sacrifice, we're worshiping God all the time. We're a worshiping community. But there is an expectation to gather together. You can't miss that in the early church in Acts 2, where they gathered together for at least 5 reasons: for teaching, for fellowship, for worship, for service, for evangelism. And at least 3 of 5 of those can't really be done remotely. The fellowship, virtual is not fellowship. And you had to touch, you had to lay hands on people. You need to gather for the element, the ordinances, the sacraments, all of these things. So I'm in concert with his thinking, and I don't think our choice to open or close or suspend regular worship should necessitate us changing our theology.
Paul, what about you?
Well, I'm in broad agreement with most of what Rick has said. I know Pastor Stephen Richardson. He and I have had some debates in the past on Sabbatarianism. He actually was a Baptist. He was part of my denomination. And then under Sabbatarian convictions, under growing Presbyterian convictions, left and joined the Presbyterians. So he's operating out of his convictions, and I have tremendous respect for that. However, I'm not a Presbyterian, nor am I a Sabbatarian. So I don't, for example, understand the 4th commandment as a binding commandment to gather every 7th day. Although, like Rick, I don't know how you define the church without the concept of gathering. I wouldn't make the effort. Ecclesia means the assembly. So I resonate with that, but I guess I arrive at a similar place by a dissimilar road. Certainly, I see the strong exhortation towards gathering in Hebrews 10:25. And so I recognize that. However, I guess I would say, though, when you have two competing principles in Scripture, you have to sit down and figure out how to mediate those. And I also see in Romans 13 that we're clearly commanded to be in subjection to civil authorities. And so that causes us to be thinking about how that all works out. Luther and Calvin both talked about the two kingdoms. So they talked about the unmediated reign of Christ over certain things, a vertical dimension. And then they talked about how Christ rules over our conduct in the horizontal realm through civil authorities. Romans 13:6, Paul actually refers to the civil magistrate as the ministers of God, using a word that's normally reserved for religious officials. So I think there's a sense in which I would say that sometimes we obey Jesus by obeying the civil magistrate. And in this circumstance, again, I don't want to exaggerate the hermeneutical distance between a Presbyterian myself or a Sabbatarian myself, but I would say I'm probably more Lutheran, or to use an Anglican terminology, a hookerite. I don't know if that still has currency in Anglican worlds, but I'm more of a classic Lutheran in understanding the relationship of civil government to the church. I'm also more of a classic Lutheran than say a Puritan Calvinist with respect to understanding the Mosaic Law, and so I would use Lutheran terminology. In Luther's sermon on Galatians 4, he talked about the Mosaic Law as a tutor and a guide. And that's the terminology that I would tend to use, that as a born again Christian with a regenerated heart filled with the Holy Spirit, I find myself ending up in all the same places as directed by the civil or by the Mosaic Law in terms of the moral code. But I tend to think that there's room for some discretion there. So in the matter of Hebrews 10:25, I see that as a strong encouragement, but alongside with even some Puritans who I think of Richard Baxter, who allowed for deferring large gatherings in the church in the case of pestilence or war. He stated that explicitly in his directory. So I think that there are streams of thought on this within the Reformed world. There are those who feel a more rigid obligation based on their interpretation of the fourth commandment. And there are those who feel some room for discretion to temporarily defer or omit large gatherings. But I would also say I'm also not as pessimistic towards what can be accomplished in these circumstances. I recognize that the inability to meet in large groups is a significant hindrance, and it's an injury to the church. I'd want to talk about providence, and I'd want to ask what God is doing through this injury. Ultimately, he has to be the primary author of it. But I'm not completely dissatisfied is not the right word, but I think there are things that you can accomplish through smaller meetings of 10. I spend a lot of time on the phone now. I've got a whole shelf of letters that Calvin wrote to people that he was not physically present with, but that he clearly ministered to. And back before Zoom and during the Spanish flu, pastors didn't have the opportunity to do services online. They wrote letters to their congregants. So I think there is precedent for finding ways in extraordinary times to minister to your people. But I have broad sympathy with everything Rick said.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about the nature of gathering, sort of embodiment gathering of the church, do we think of it in sort of ideal terms, in the sense that this would be the best sort of expression of the church, but recognize it as it gets to some of the ecclesiological things that I think maybe Rick, you might have been raising, about the sort of spiritual nature of the church, that the church, the term, Hooker uses is the church militant of the church here, but the church is also the church triumphant. Is there a sense in which our reality, and this larger kind of ecclesial sort of reality, means that we can be the church, whatever the kind of constraints that the government may place upon us. And so, the challenge before us is how to live faithfully under these constraints while still achieving and demonstrating and participating in this larger notion of the church.
Well, I'll jump in here first, Paul. Obviously, God has enabled his remnant of people to thrive in any and every circumstance imaginable. I suppose not every circumstance imaginable. There's more yet to come, or more possibilities. But tracking the history of God's people, circumstances, restrictions, hindrances, persecution, none of these things have hindered the movement of God and the ability of God to minister to his people to minister. So that goes without saying, I think. And I concur with Paul. It's not like I'm not pessimistic about the moment. We've actually added people to the church, and are adding people even as of last night. We met and talked about new members coming in. So it's not like ministry is not happening, or that ministry can't happen. My goodness, the restrictions that we're under and the technology that we have is hardly any comparison to anything that's been difficult for God's people in history. This is not a big deal in terms of ministry restriction. It is necessary, though, for us to, and my argument has been, let's not surrender. Let's not take a deep dive into the shallow end of our theology and bump our heads right now. This would be a bad moment to do that. Let's not loose anything that we believe, and let's find ways to minister in what we have. And I'm fine with agreeing with that. But I do find that the restrictions that we are in are completely unusual. For instance, it's easier to meet in China than it is in Canada, because the underground house church is already, they've already found ways for a long time to actually gather and assemble as the body, to minister to one another, to fellowship, to koinonia, the touch, the necessary ways to touch. They've already discovered how to do that.
Rick, could I jump in? I don't want to break your train of thought, but you got me thinking about something interesting, and if I don't say it, I'll forget. But would you wonder, like as I do, whether this is in some way a dress rehearsal for future persecution? One of the reasons I haven't chafed too greatly under these restrictions is because I think that actually it's benefiting our church. We are figuring out how to break our reasonably large church down into smaller and smaller units that could sustain a season of real formal persecution as per China. Do you feel that there's any kindness from God in that?
I'm totally there.
Okay.
I've been there since the beginning. I addressed our congregation from the very beginning and said I felt this was a dress rehearsal for what could come, what could happen. So I do believe, I'm big on the sovereignty of God, of course, and do believe that God is in this, and that the church is needing to learn some things. I think you wrote a great article on us doing some self-reflection on as opposed to looking at everybody else on the outside, look at ourselves and understand what we can learn from this and go from here. And I think those are the important lessons to be learned. But the problem right now is the Canadian government, or the Ontario government, won't even let us go to some people's houses. Now, by the way, people ought to know that they can have a religious gathering in their house of 10 people. That's lawful, and so more people should be perhaps taking advantage of that. But
not all the health units know that. I agree with you, Rick. And I was in conversation with a pastor in, I believe, Southwestern Ontario about this very thing. He wrote to his local health unit and said, because he's a church planter, he had lost access to his building.
Right.
And he said, so we're allowed to have religious services of 10 people as long as we're properly spaced. I'm going to be doing that in my church basement. And they denied that. And I wrote back to him and said, you should press on that. Get a lawyer to look into that, because it's very possible that your local health unit is simply unaware that provision extends to house churches.
Yeah, because that's an Ontario regulation, actually.
Yeah.
Places of worship
Yeah.
Religious gatherings do not have to be in a church building.
That's right.
So but those restrictions of 10 are very limiting. You can't actually have a house church. You can't have a structure with official leadership and the kind of thing that's going on in China. So that restrictions are greater right now than they are in China. And that's perhaps the concern that I'm voicing here with respect to the situation we're in. And
so you both raised two images, and I wonder if they're complementary, or one of them is this idea that this is a dress rehearsal for for future suffering that God is calling the church to. But I've also heard the suggestion that maybe this is God's chastisement on the church. And do you ever think of what's happening in the life of the church because of COVID, that it's doing something to sanctify the church, or intended to sanctify the church? And how would you explain that?
Absolutely. I think that's always the first question we should ask. In fact, I'll be honest with you. I think we've spent far too much time railing against the agents of this lockdown and not nearly enough time repenting before the author of this lockdown. When bad things happen to God's people, your first response is supposed to be asking the question, what's God saying to me in this? Now, John 9:1-3 cautions us about doing that for other people. When we see bad things happening to other people, we're not supposed to point at them and say, oh, gee, I wonder if it's because they did this sin or that sin. But the general tenor of the scriptures is that when bad things happen, the first thing we're supposed to do is ask, what is God saying to me in this? And I just have been shocked by how little discourse there has been around that topic. Rick, I'm not surprised to know that you've been doing that, but I haven't heard that from a lot of pastors. A lot of pastors are spending most of their time being angry at the agent as opposed to being on their faces before the author. So I think that should be our first instinct. But I would say, as to these two metaphors that have been introduced, I think they're one and the same. I think God chastises us in order to prepare us. Right now, let's be honest. So let's rewind, 16 months. The evangelical church in North America of 16 months ago was not well positioned to, survive, endure, and thrive in a time of persecution. I think a decent argument can be made that 16 months ago, the evangelical church was the weakest, the most compromised, diluted, and fractured that it has been in its history. So how could this be anything other than good for the evangelical church? I think it'll be a time of refining, pruning, and preparing.
Yeah, you won't find disagreement with me there. I think Paul's right. I think the world is being judged and the church is being tested. And I think that's how God has functioned and how he's worked. We've seen him work that way. And it's necessary for us to prepare ourselves. I think, some of the statistics or statements or prophecies that are being made is 1 in 5 churches will close down in North America. And I think this is a winnowing process. I think that it's a distilling process. I hope it won't be this way, but I don't expect our church to be the same size at the other side of this. I think there's a lot of consumers and a lot of hangers on, and particularly in evangelical churches that are not necessarily really those who follow Christ with a passion. And this will
100%.
root that out. I think that there are churches that are we would call it liberal churches that have a very, very poor hold on the things of God, and they'll be closing. I'm understanding that 5 churches in one liberal denomination are closing in our city alone during this particular pandemic. And I'm not surprised to hear that.
And it won't be bad for the church as a whole. Rick, you may have been there. A few years ago, I sat in on a talk from Mark Dever called Nominalism, the Suicide of the Evangelical Church. I don't know if you sat in on that as well. It was down at T4G, but I found that to be an absolutely fascinating talk and a very relevant take. I think that it's possible that this pandemic will function kind of like a forest fire. It will be initially traumatic, but it will serve the long-term health of the ecosystem.
And so what will the new ecosystem look like? I mean, you sort of raised the question about the size of churches. What will the mega church look like? What will rural churches look like?
Well, I wrote at the start of this pandemic, when it first sort of got me thinking, maybe I'll go back and revisit the article, but I wrote an article called "The COVIDian Exile of the Church." And one of the things that I was just wondering about is this the death of the megachurch? I don't think, in retrospect, I don't think the megachurch has been great for North American evangelicalism. I think it has certainly provided a platform for exceptionally gifted leaders. But I don't know that it's been good for people at pew level. I find it interesting that this particular challenge appears to have been designed by God to dethrone the charismatic preacher. We're all small church pastors now. We're all meeting in circles of 10. We're all talking to old ladies on the phone. None of us are rock stars anymore. I think that's been good. I think every church on the other side, I don't think this is necessarily the end of gifted leaders. I don't think it's necessarily the end of extra ecclesial influence. I don't think this is even the end of larger churches. But I think that if there is a megachurch on the other side of this pandemic, they'll have figured out how to be micro communities within a larger structure.
Yeah, I mean, the discussion about megachurch in Canada is not really that germane. We have, I don't think we have the megachurch structure with a few very big churches, but not many. I think it'll be a blow to the megachurch. I don't think the megachurch is going away anytime soon because I don't think malls are going away anytime soon. Big stadiums are not going away anytime soon. Just the way we look for goods and services is not going away anytime soon. And mega churches are bastions of goods and services, and that's what makes them work. And mega churches, or let's just talk larger churches in Canada. Mm-hmm. Larger churches have known for quite some time to work on making sure that the church is small by having smaller groupings. It's not new. I think most of us are glad that God gave us a ramp up to this in terms of preparing ourselves with smaller group discipleship vision and passion, which is late for at least for our movement, would be relatively late on the scene in the last 2 decades, maybe, but has developed in quite a flourishing style of ministry. And that's prepared us for the moment. We're still able to host and keep small groupings together, virtually, of course, mostly. But there's a value to that. And I think we have learned that the value of that is even greater than we thought. And I think that's going to be the big value coming out the other side. What we thought and what we knew and what we were trying as leaders to encourage the people to think and believe has been demonstrated to them in loud proportion, that it's necessary to have yourself prepared for small collections of people who can minister to one another in tough times. And that's a good thing at the end of this. And I think it will be a passionately driven on the other side of this.
That's really good. Yeah, I'd like to circle back to this, certainly at the end, part for selfish reasons. I'm really curious to know what the implications of our period of COVID are on theological colleges and the need to produce leaders for a new church. But I want to get us back into the question of the government and the church's relationship to government. And to do this, I think it's time for another poll. And so I'd like to put up the second poll here. And here we're thinking back at the story of Trinity Bible Chapel, or maybe some churches in the States, John MacArthur's Grace Community Church. And the question is, do you sympathize with these churches who want to reject the civil government's regulations, but you don't agree with what they did? Or you sympathize with the churches and believe that your church should do the same, you have no opinion, or you disagree and you think that they should adhere to government guidelines? So let's just take a moment to fill that poll out.
I voted. I assume we're invited to participate. I find these polls fascinating.
I think so, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Just as long as you didn't click the one that says I have no opinion.
No.
Yeah.
I'll just leave the meeting.
Yeah. All right. Looks like we're probably done. Oh no, there's still a couple more coming in. Looks like we've got 61 of 70 people voting. So let's call it at that, shall we? All right, let's look at the poll. So a little better than half sympathize with the churches, but they don't agree with what they did. There's nearly 20% who think that their own churches should follow suit. And then finally, nearly a quarter of us think that we disagree with what those churches have done and believe that they should adhere to government guidelines.
Now, number 1 and number 4 are similar, right? So, basically you've got 78% of people disagreeing, but some sympathetically and some not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of a tough place to sort of think about things in a way. I mean, my assumption is that there are different ways that people imagine the government plays a role in the rule of God in civil society, and so perhaps we could just chat about that for a little bit.
If I could jump in for a second here, Stephen, before we just move on to the government thought. I think when you think of MacArthur or Jacob in Waterloo, the decision process of both of these pastors has been not only a theological position on who and what the church is, and not only a position on theologically on what the government has a right to do, but their own personal opinions on how dangerous this moment actually is.
100%.
And I think a lot of the problem, a lot of why we can't agree with each other right now is not theological, to be honest. It's practical. It's pragmatic. It's government.
Mm-hmm.
It's lack of trust. It's lack of transparency. It's science science in conflict. What are we amateurs to make of epidemiologists? I mean, as a church pastor, I've tried to do my homework. I've tried to interview my own epidemiologists. And I'm talking about highly regarded epidemiologists on one side and highly regarded epidemiologists on other sides, trained at the same good universities, whether University of Toronto or Western or wherever, taking completely opposite positions. And so I'm pretty convinced in terms of this little straw poll we just did, that neither MacArthur nor Riom in Waterloo would have opened their churches and put their people knowingly at health risk if they actually believed that this virus was risky. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about the conflict we're having because of this. The conflict that has been created has been outside of the church and imposed upon us. The government can't agree. The scientists can't agree. The health practitioners can't agree. And now they're imposing upon us to make decisions for our congregations on what we should or should not do. And
but isn't that in essence what civil government is for? So I agree with you. I think a lot of why, meaning I think 50% of the chaos and disagreement in the evangelical church is theological. How many people know whether they fall into the sphere sovereignty camp or the two kingdoms camp, right? Those are the two main lenses for understanding this from a Reformed perspective. I bet you 8 out of 10 pastors, if you shone a bright light on them, don't know which of those they believe in because they haven't read either. So 50% of the chaos is theological. And then 50% of the chaos it has to do with epidemiology, which, as you say, is unsettled. But here's where I would actually push back out of my two kingdoms lens and say, but isn't that the point of civil government? Civil government saves us from anarchy. Anarchy is when we all operate according to our own judgment. So my cousin, who I grew up with, one of my best friends, he thinks this is all a hoax. He thinks, COVID is a joke. We're all going to be fine. Okay. I don't. I think part of the reason we don't necessarily intuitively recognize the risk is because it's slow building. It doesn't appeal to the non-mathematical mind. It has to do with exponential spread and the overwhelming of the healthcare system. It's not as obvious as a bus coming at your forehead. So I think it's a real thing. My cousin doesn't. I'm glad neither of us are in charge. I took 2 science courses in university. I'm not aware that he took any. So I'm actually glad that this is out of my hands and I can just get on with the business of the kingdom. But again, I'm coming at this out of my two kingdoms approach. Other people feel like this is just a massive example of government overreach, right? So if you are a theonomist with an anti-statist tendency, then you feel like your mandate right now is to press back on the government overreach and to, shrink them into an ever shrinking sphere. But again, these are the issues. These are the complexities. We've got theology and we've got epidemiology in a toxic swirl.
Sure. But you've got pastors who are fully convinced and fully convicted that they are answering to God, obviously. And so, whether the government, the magistrate is saying something scientific to them about healthcare or not, ultimately their convictions, ecclesially are clearly put at risk by their choice to suspend the operation of their church, the gathering of their church, for something that they don't feel is actually legitimately concerning enough. And I agree with you. I happen to be a sphere sovereignty kind of person, so I see the overreach of the government as a concern, and I would see the government. The statistics on the news tonight were that this has been the worst year ever for suicides or loss of life by this opiate crisis.
Yeah.
And they even interviewed individuals who were saying, my world has been taken away from me. It seems to me that leaving hospitals open is a really good idea during a health crisis, but I would suggest that it's probably a really good idea to leave churches open as well during a huge emotional, social, spiritual crisis.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is where many...
I don't disagree with you. I get there differently, but I don't disagree with you.
Yeah. And many pastors are saying, is the government giving us good government? I think that's the bottom line, is, are we getting good government? And that's why we're having, I think, such conflict. But I just want to go back, and I just want to stay on that track, though, that I think MacArthur and his choices, and I think Trinity and their choices, have to be put and framed in the context of their total complete belief, and with studied and helped belief. They've got doctors, they've got lawyers in their congregations, they've got experts.
But again, if we all just marshal expert, that's just anarchy, right? Because that's the thing with a novel coronavirus. I could probably find 5 doctors on the internet easily within 10 minutes who think this is, a non-issue, a non-event, a low consequence situation. And I can find obviously a great number who think that it's a serious thing. So, this just becomes an exercise in confirmation bias, right? You Google a question that gets you an answer. I Google a question that gets me an answer. And we all operate as private princes. I would say that's the whole point of Romans 13. Romans 13 is in the Bible because the world ruled by private preference is a nasty and brutish place. And so there have to be some who will look at all these various, experts and their counsel and all these numbers and charts and make a plan that the rest of us need to be in submission to.
But Paul, that Paul, you know that their authority is limited.
Of course. Oh, of course. But it's
And
not.
so it becomes subjective. It always becomes subjective to all of us as to where that limitation is.
Yeah. And this is why we're having the conversation. This is why I actually think it's a great conversation, meaning I'm not sure many people have thought very deeply as to how does the government's authority infringe or overlap, encroach on mine. I remember when I wrote about divorce, when I wrote an article for TGC Canada, what does the Bible say about divorce and remarriage? Touched on the issue of spousal abuse, because as you know, the Bible doesn't actually provide an exemption on the matter of spousal abuse. But I actually leaned into my two kingdoms matrix and said, well, here's what would happen in my church if a man abused his wife. My first phone call would be to 911. I'd call the cops. My second call would be to the chairman of our board of elders, and we'd immediately open a church discipline case. Why? Because I don't think that the family has sphere sovereignty. Well, no, I don't actually. I think that the family has significant authority, but I think there's an overlap of government authority. And if you beat your wife, I'm calling the magistrate. That doesn't mean that I don't believe that a husband should exercise spiritual leadership. It just means I believe the husband in doing so is subject to the civil magistrate.
Yeah,
so I think there's significant overlap there.
Yeah, I don't think anybody who believes sphere sovereignty doesn't see the overlap either.
No, I don't imagine they would if you put it to them that starkly. But I think when you talk in terms of sphere sovereignty and when you are explicitly anti-statist, then it puts you in the posture of constantly trying to push government into a smaller and smaller box. Calvin said that the government provides more benefit than bread and air and water, and he says it is of a more noble constitution. So the magisterial reformers had a pretty generous view of government. And I think one of the realities that we're dealing with today is that we don't. We have an extraordinarily negative view on government, and we want as little of it as humanly possible. And now that viewpoint has put us in a bit of a pickle.
Well, the same man who wrote Romans 13 certainly appealed to the government at every level. He started with the high priest. He went to the Sanhedrin.
Yep.
He then went
always
to
operating
Felix.
Within it.
He goes to Felix. He goes to Festus. He goes to King Agrippa. Ultimately appeals to Rome.
Yep.
To Caesar.
Yep.
Took advantage in every possible way and ultimately ended up in a clash with the government and lost his life.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Well, and the reformers told us to expect that, in this fallen world, we are often going to find ourselves on the wrong side of government power. They were realists about government, but the alternative is anarchy. And the hope is the reign of Christ, the return of Christ. So, again, we're getting into all the sort of Christ and culture. What's our posture towards culture? Which, again, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. Nobody's had this conversation. Or I shouldn't say nobody. Not very many people have had this conversation. And, I find myself kind of in the overlap between Luther and Calvin on that. I have this kind of paradoxical approach, that characterized Luther, where you sort of just understand that to be in culture, to be under the authority of the magistrate, to be waiting for the return of Christ, puts you in all kinds of weird paradoxes. But that's life in a fallen world until Jesus comes.
So do we have differing views actually of what Romans 13 actually teaches? And how do you understand the purpose of the state in God's rule? You've talked about, the Calvinist tradition, you've talked about Luther, but they actually had different takes on this themselves. In Luther's view, the state was intended to prevent sin. In Calvin's view, the state was there to promote order. There were kind of a sort of positive and negative functions to government. So how do you understand Romans 13 in that respect? And does that change the way that we respond to restrictions like we've received from our government?
Well, I love Douglas Moo's comment here. He says the history of interpretation of Romans 13 is largely the history of attempts to avoid what the passage clearly seems to be saying. And I would agree with that. I mean, it's amazing to what great lengths we go to either limit or avoid what Romans 13 seems to be saying. Paul seems to be saying that we are to be subject to governing authorities, that Christ reigns over us in part through civil magistrates. I would agree with Luther that the king does not, or the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain, that there's a function there of restraining evil. Calvin had a broader view. He talked about also in a positive sense promoting good, and I think he used the phrase all things related to human flourishing or something along those lines.
Right.
Yeah, the public good. Magistrates may hence learn what their vocation is, for they are not to rule for their own interests, but for the public good. The right of government is ordained by God for the well-being of mankind. So yeah, I would probably be more Calvinistic in that sense, in terms of the role, but I'm not sure that Luther didn't believe that. It's just that Luther spent most of his time talking about how government is necessary to restrain human sin.
I wonder if we've thought through enough the context with which Paul actually delivered that statement to the Roman Christians, the Roman believers, in that I wonder if there wasn't an expectation, or I'm certain there was an expectation that when Christ came, the Messianic age was upon them. And certainly Jews turning to Christ, coming from a theocratic style of understanding God's people, and then being thrust into exile, and talk about an Old Testament community thrust into exile for hundreds of years, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and finally coming to the place where they were like, finally, the Messiah has come. The theocracy will be returned to us. I mean, all the prophets are saying, this is going to be God's hand of judgment. Finally, that the wicked will be done away with, and the glory of Christ and reigning and all that will be upon us. And even John the Baptist was stunned with the fact that didn't happen, and asked, is Jesus really the one? Because we were expecting something a lot more exciting than this. We were expecting something way better. We were finally expecting to be on the winning side, and the nations come and bow to our King. And I wonder if Paul, in writing in the context, same with Peter, writing to Christians significant, and many of them Jews, significantly under great persecution throughout the Asia Minor, Rome itself, was making a point to them that, hey guys, this is not going to be the government you were hoping for. You're not going to get the theocracy. You're going to get pagan government. You're going to be in exile. And in fact, to be quite frank, for 2,000 years, really, the church has been in exile to pagan government. This is a COVIDian exile, but Paul, you'll agree with us. We've been in exile long before this. We are a community of faith in exile. Absolutely. Under the regime of pagan leadership and dominance for the most part. So having that whole context and thinking through that context, it strikes me that and I'm not sure who I read. It'd be a long time ago when I preached through Romans, but one take on Romans 13 and the obedience to government was that, and Stephen, maybe I know you've studied in the area of the epistles, but maybe someone said that perhaps the point being made there was, don't mess with the government and have them kill you all before the fledgling church even gets a chance to gain hold on this earth. And so it was a more localized statement by both Peter and Paul, because neither of them put that forward as an absolute. We know that the pagan government's not the absolute. God is. So we know they never put forth an absolute, but they did put forth a statement of God's order, of good government, of the necessary government. You're right, Paul, to prevent anarchy and chaos and all of that. But primarily in the Christian sense, settle down, guys. Don't fight the government. Don't have them kill you all. Seek to cooperate with them. Seek to thrive. Seek to live quiet, godly lives under the radar and advance the kingdom of Christ. And I think I'm personally feeling that we need to think about the context of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and the situation of the people at the time, and read it into our moment, and understand that there's a time to rise up, and there will be times that you'll have to, but if you can endure, the government's restrictions, if you're going to endure what the government's putting forward, then do so for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of advancing the gospel and leading that quiet life. But not, again, that's what I've been saying from the start, not surrendering anything of our theology to suddenly make it the issue of the moment and say hard, fast. Okay, so hard, fast, take Romans 13, obey government. It's easy. There's nothing to think about here. The government says we're locked down. We should be locked down until they say we shouldn't be locked down. I'm not sure that Paul meant that. And I'm not sure Peter meant that. As we don't even think about it, we don't even consider whether or not this is in the interests of or the good of the people. So
and I don't think they've ever been. I don't think that those texts have ever been understood in an absolute sense. How could they be, right? Because Acts 5:29 is in the Bible. The same Peter, who told us to honor the emperor, at one point said, "Hey, we got to obey God rather than men." So I think there's a general rule. I think there's a recognized exception, and then the task of the church is to figure out, where am I? Is this general rule time? Is this recognized exception time? And I wrote the article, My Threshold for Civil Disobedience in a COVID-19 World. And I think, and I made clear in that article, I wasn't saying it should be your threshold. I wasn't speaking for TGC. It wasn't speaking for my denomination. I said, this is where I've wrestled. And I think every pastor needs to be doing that right now. And Rick, I want to be clear, because I know you know this, and I know you believe this. So I just don't want anyone to hear what you're not saying. You're not saying that because there's a local background and a contextual background for Romans 13 that it doesn't have enduring relevance. You're just saying that the local background needs to inform its application.
Absolutely. That's
absolutely,
exactly
100%. Okay. And I just want to make sure everyone's got that. And R.C. Sproul says the same thing. He says, commenting on Romans 13, he says, the principle is easy. The application is difficult. We are not free, however, to disobey the civil magistrate when we disagree with it, or when authorities make us suffer or experience inconvenience. I think that just needs to be on the table. The standard for moving from general rule to recognized exception is not inconvenience, and it's not disagreement. The standard is injustice.
Agreed. And that's why I think it's really important for us, in terms of making these judgment calls on Trinity in Waterloo or John MacArthur in California, to understand that these men are coming from conviction. I don't believe for one second, and I believe they're making a judgment call on their threshold of obedience or disobedience. And I don't think it's really in our place to sit in qualified judgment on what they're doing.
No, that's the job of the court. And I don't agree with how they got there, but oftentimes I feel that with the guys on the other end of this conversation. I feel like I end up in the same place as you. I just wouldn't have got there that way. Like, I think that the way we should have got here is we should have sponsored a charter challenge. And
let's talk about the witness of the church in this. I mean, you both have, we've moved to this place of the church in its kind of integrity in terms of its stand on the gospel and its relationship to the world, under the reality of civil government. One of the questions that has been posted here is, should the church's witness to non-believers be a consideration in whether or not to follow the civil law? What about those who look on and see the disregard for the rules as irresponsible behavior?
Yeah. Oh, that's my main concern in all this. Like, I think that, Paul, Romans 12 says, give thought for what is noble in the sight of all. I'm not sure that we've given enough thought to what is noble in the sight of all. I think that to the average outside watcher on, they think, the churches care more about their liberty than they do about our safety. I don't think that's helpful. And I think there were ways of getting here, personally, I think there are ways of getting here that wouldn't have had to pay that price. That we could have sponsored a charter challenge to find out whether these limits are reasonable, right? Because the charter, we don't have an absolute freedom of religious expression in Canada. That I hear people say that all the time. Well, we get the charter right. All charter rights have to be balanced. They're subject to reasonable limits. And so the government has a burden to demonstrate that this was a reasonable limit. And I, again, in line with Calvin, I'd say let's use the lesser magistrate to challenge the overreach of the higher magistrate. So let's get our lawyers together. Let's have a charter challenge. Let's find out if these were reasonable limits. That's the way to do it. And I don't think that would bother our neighbors in the least. They would understand. So that's been my preference, that we should use the permission we have, safeguard the witness of the church, use the lesser magistrate to ask the government to demonstrate whether these restrictions have been reasonable.
Rick, I want to hear you on that, but I also know that we've got a poll that relates to this. So as you answer this question, we're going to, I think, put that poll up and see where folks come from. On the whole, I think the church has shown good leadership and positive witness to society, could do more to be a positive witness, has not been vocal enough, or has shown poor leadership. So while they're doing that, Rick, you talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with Paul in the sense that I think the church has not done a very good public relations job. And however, I would disagree with him that were we to be granted by the government through a charter rights challenge, the right to open, I believe our neighbors would still chaff at the church, because it actually the neighbors who don't believe in Jesus Christ and the mission of the church and the beliefs that we have are no friend of ours and do not support our practice. And we've experienced the harshness of that as we have abided by not only our rights according to the law, but our responsibilities according to the scriptures. And those outside of faith did not find it a good public relations move. So,
well, not everything will. Yeah, sometimes you have to pay that price.
Here's the problem. This isn't about theology for our neighbors. This is about their health, and they believe that churches that are opening or attempting to open or seeking court orders to open, even if those court orders were granted and it was entirely lawful, would still find it awful that these churches open, because you're putting us all at risk. Mm-hmm. This is entirely about healthcare. And so I think the public relations disaster of the church has been to not educate the public as to why we would want to even open, why we would risk being open, why we would risk allegedly risk their health. And it has to be because there are greater issues at stake than simply physical health. There is emotional, mental, we go through spiritual health, the fact that individuals and families are losing their job, family violence is up, drug addiction is up, the poor are not being taken care of, the poor of the world are suffering for this. This is not, unfortunately, the public relations sees, well, they just want to open because they want their offering plates to be filled, and because so we needed to do a better job, and whoever's opening needed to do a better job of explaining to our neighbors why we would even propose a charter challenge that we might be open. They would not accept that unless we had a valid reason. They don't question why hospitals are open. They don't question why Costco's open. Well, some do. They don't question why the grocery store is open, because we have to eat. So nobody's upset about that. Nobody's upset about the health concerns that happens. I know people are chirping about that, but their freezer will run out very soon if we close all the grocery stores.
You have to live well. You
have to live well. And yep. Churches needed to do a better job, and we need to do a better job now if we're going to press forward and press for opening, of making the case. Why would we even consider risking sickness to open?
But Rick, I agree substantially with most of what you said. I would just put it this way. I would love to see a charter challenge to discover whether these restrictions were reasonable. And then I would love for the church to be able to say to the community, we're still waiting to get the last word on the epidemiology here, and we're still going to listen very carefully to what the government requests. We would just now like to receive it as a request, as opposed to a requirement. I think that would give us the opportunity to give witness, because I think, listen, even if I were legally allowed to open, if the government were able to demonstrate convincingly, which they would have to try to do through a charter process, that it was not safe for me to open in that way, I think it'd be great witness for us to say to the community, we're legally allowed, but we're actually not going to use our full permission out of public safety interests.
Well,
unfortunately, we don't have that opportunity.
We used to spread the flu and pneumonia at will, and no one seemed to have a problem with it.
Well, yeah.
Listen,
again, it depends on whether you think this is more serious than the flu.
Well, seriously.
Yeah.
We can't actually manage disease this way going forward.
No, I don't disagree.
Society, so if this is a dress rehearsal for anything, or a dry run for anything, or whatever this is the last dry run that we can do this way.
No, I agree. And I think you and I are very close to being on the same page here, meaning I think we agree that public relations wise, the open protest, the being on the news, the having Doug Ford talk about us, that has not been helpful. At the same time, I think we would also agree these lockdowns don't appear to be very targeted or effective. I think the difference is, how we would like to be engaging with the government. I think posture matters. I think tone matters. And I think approach matters. I'd like to be doing this upwards through the lower magistrate. I'd like to be doing this through the courts, not on the news, not on Facebook. So anyway, but in terms of where we'd like to get, I think you and I want to get to the same place.
I think it's time for us to move to wrap up here in just a moment. But the poll results indicate that roughly 70% of those feel as though the church can be a more positive witness in these circumstances. I think what we've heard has been really helpful in getting beyond the kind of stereotypical views that have been expressed of churches like Trinity Bible Chapel, and has also helped us again get a deeper sort of insight to some of the nuances of the way that we approach Scripture. This has all been very helpful. And so I'm grateful to you both. But I did say at the beginning that there are a number of folks on this conversation who are students, and many of them are preparing for leadership in the church. And a number of them, when they started their theological training, came into a church that's radically different now going forward. What sort of advice would you have for them, or what do you see that this time in the life of the church has identified as characteristics of leadership for the future?
Just to clarify the question, are you asking like sort of what counsel we would give to younger pastors starting out as to how to pastor in this moment, or are you asking more what lessons have been learned from COVID that could be applied to pastoral ministry moving forward?
What are the things that you think that students who are graduating and moving into pastorates need to know about the ministry that's different from when they came in to their theological training? In other words, what has this moment sort of revealed about the church and its needs that they need to be aware of?
Well, I'll let Rick have the last word because he's the more veteran pastor. But I would say that ecclesiology is the burning need of the hour. A pastor friend of mine said that to me. Actually, you probably know him as well, Rick. Tim Kerr. We went for a walk back when you could go for walks in the early stages of this pandemic, and he said that in his opinion, it is ecclesiology that has been revealed as the doctrine in most urgent need of recovery as a result of the pressures applied by COVID. And I would agree. I think we need to know what the church is, why the church is. I think we need to know I think there needs to be a reformation of pastoral ministry. I think the power of the pulpit has been reduced. And again, that's under the ordination of
Hmm.
God. And I wonder if the Lord is pulling the rug out from underneath the solo dominant pastor who wants to be the only voice, who's turned his church into a theater for his own performance art. And I think this is going to push us into plurality. Rick, you mentioned you're doing 15 services a Sunday. I guarantee you, I don't know, but I guarantee you, you're not preaching at all those. So all of a sudden you've got lay leaders giving exhortations, reading scripture, reading a hymn, as we do here, and so I think we're learning about plurality. And then, of course, there's an aspect of ecclesiology that has to figure out how it relates to the state. And again, I think 18 months ago, if you shone a bright light on a pastor and asked him whether he was a sphere sovereignty guy or a two kingdoms guy, 8 out of 10 would not know the answer to that. And so that's a deficiency that has to be ironed out in a hurry.
Yeah, I agree obviously with that for sure. And I think that the pastor now is going to need to have some ability to converse with a multiple of disciplines, the law, science, politics, and understand, at least culturally, the setting that they're in, and understand how to navigate in that setting. I think that there's a real need for pastors to understand church and cultural history and understand, how we fit into this long line of 2,000 years of church history, as opposed to thinking in smaller segments of time and not understand. I think pastors today need to understand the emerging dangers that are coming from multiple directions, and primarily and particularly they need to understand the emerging dangers within theology itself, within the church itself, and as shepherds who need to keep watch of their flock, of Christ's flock, and that requires boldness, requires mental acuity, requires emotional stability, in ways that and I would say over all of that, a walk with Christ, a communion with the Spirit of God, amped up beyond what we thought we might have needed, is crucial now. It always has been. This is nothing new, Stephen, to any of your students, I'm sure, but I would say, in terms of being of sound mind in the pressures of things unthought of years ago, requires a walk with God and a strength of Christ in your life to maintain a proper leadership qualification. And we've seen this past year, we have seen the demise of ministries and giants who we thought were giants of the faith. And I think, if anything, being sidelined a little bit and quieted down and shuffled off a little bit has given us all time to pause and think about the fact that maybe we've allowed our calendars to eliminate any margin at all for the Lord and shut him out of time. And these are not days when you can just do the business of the church and keep busy doing the church and keep busy doing the work of Christ and learning and exegeting texts, and not having a strong heart with a strong heart time with the Lord to protect you from because he will build this church. He will build his church. It's not our job to build his church, but he builds his church, and he has to build us. And without that, we are woefully ill-equipped to handle the pressure of right now, for sure.
Well, amen. Thank you for that. That's a word in season. And I want to thank you both. You're a great encouragement, I think, to us. You've helped us think hard about the place of the church in the world. And we're grateful for your example as leaders of integrity, seeking to be faithful in the mission that God has called you to. And we hope to be able to welcome you back to a fireside chat sometime in the future. I just want to check with the man behind the curtain here, Steve Hugo, to find out if there are dates and topics for our next gathering. I don't know if he's going to show himself or just type an answer to me. He says, next gathering on leadership. So folks, watch this space. But in the meantime, once again, thank you both, Paul and Rick. Steve says it's going to be on the last Friday of February. So watch your calendar there. Can I say a brief word of prayer before we say farewell?
Great.
Please do.
Gracious God, we do thank you for this conversation that we've had this evening and for the way the church continues to try to discern your will in the complexities of our contemporary society. We do thank you for the freedom and liberty that you have given us in Christ. And we pray that you would help us to receive those things, not just as gifts, but as responsibilities, as you free us and liberate us for Jesus Christ and for his purposes in the world. We pray that the church would be attentive to the work of your Spirit as it seeks to be faithful, to be a witness for Jesus Christ in a way that wins the admiration of the world and in a way that draws the world to him. And we pray these things in his name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks very much.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And we'll see you at the end of February.